Ethan Cole stood quietly at the signing and celebration party, being laughed at and treated like he did not belong. What none of them knew was that the $500 million deal saving their family company was to be signed by him. The man they mocked, the billionaire they ignored, and the truth was about to come out before the celebration ended. Ethan Cole stood near the edge of the ballroom holding a glass of water he had not touched, watching crystal lights shimmer above polished marble floors while laughter and celebration filled the air around him. He wore a plain dark suit without flashy tailoring, blending into the background as waiters passed by carrying silver trays and executives toasted a future they believed had been rescued by someone else. The family who owned Colford Industries moved through the room like royalty, smiling, shaking hands, congratulating each other for surviving what the press had already called a miracle turnaround. No one noticed Ethan. Not when he stepped aside to avoid blocking photos. Not when someone brushed past him without apology. Not when a woman laughed loudly behind him, calling him security by mistake. Ethan did not correct her. He had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than explanation. At the center of the ballroom, a banner stretched across the wall celebrating the signing of a $500 million deal that would save the company from collapse and keep the family name intact. Champagne glasses clinked. Music swelled. Pride overflowed. What none of them knew was that the man they had ignored all evening was the billionaire investor whose signature had secured every smiling face in that room. Earlier that afternoon, Ethan had arrived alone, entering through a side door while preparations were still underway and nervous assistants rushed through hallways clutching documents. He had signed quietly in a private conference room with only the company lawyer present, placing his name on the final page with calm precision. No cameras, no applause, no ceremony. He had requested it that way. The lawyer had hesitated briefly before nodding, recognizing the authority in Ethan's voice without fully understanding it. Once the ink dried, Ethan shook the man's hand and said simply that he would attend the celebration anonymously. The lawyer had assumed it was a test of humility. He was wrong. It was a test of character. As the party unfolded, Ethan watched how people behaved when they believed power was elsewhere. He watched relatives boast about connections they did not have. Executives joke about cutting costs at the expense of workers. A cousin loudly complain about dealing with outsiders who did not belong in elite spaces. Each comment landed quietly in Ethan's mind. Near the head table, the company patriarch raised his glass, giving a speech filled with gratitude for unseen partners and faceless investors who had shown faith in the family legacy. He spoke of destiny, of heritage, of deserving success. Ethan listened without expression. A server accidentally bumped into him, spilling a few drops of wine onto his sleeve, and before the young man could apologize, a woman nearby scoffed loudly. "Be careful," she snapped, "some of us actually belong here." The words echoed. Ethan looked at her calmly, meeting her eyes for a brief moment before she turned away, dismissing him as unimportant. He dabbed his sleeve with a napkin and stepped back into the shadows. At another table, laughter erupted as a group of relatives mocked a man who had once applied for a job at the company and been rejected. "Can you imagine needing work like that?" one of them laughed. Ethan imagined it very clearly. He had built his empire from nothing, sleeping in his office for years before anyone cared to learn his name. A band struck up a louder tune and people flooded the dance floor, celebrating survival without understanding the cost of arrogance. Ethan checked his watch. It was almost time. Across the room, the patriarch's daughter lifted a microphone, preparing to introduce the mystery investor who had saved them. She spoke with excitement and confidence, certain that whoever this person was would enjoy the praise. Ethan remained still. She announced that the investor had requested privacy and humility and that the family respected those wishes. Applause followed. People clapped for someone they believed would never stand before them. Ethan felt no need to move. Not yet. He continued watching, listening, learning. This night was not about revenge. It was about truth, and truth always arrived when people felt safest. When the applause faded and the music resumed, Ethan took a slow breath, knowing the moment would come soon. The family had humiliated him without knowing his name. Dismissed him without understanding his value. Mocked him while standing on ground he owned. And by the end of this celebration every single person in that room would understand exactly who he was. Not through shouting, not through anger, but through revelation. The kind that changed lives forever. Ethan remained near the back of the ballroom as the celebration grew louder and confidence swelled among the family members who believed the danger had passed and that their legacy was once again untouchable. Servers moved and practiced patterns carrying food that cost more than some people earned in a month while laughter echoed off the crystal walls and every face glowed with relief. The patriarch stepped down from the stage surrounded by relatives who praised his leadership and vision, telling him the family would speak of this night for generations. Ethan watched closely, noticing how praise changed posture, how voices grew sharper, how humility disappeared the moment survival felt guaranteed. A group of executives gathered near a high table discussing layoffs they planned to announce quietly once the deal settled, explaining it was necessary to protect profit margins and investor confidence. They spoke freely because they believed no investor could hear them. Ethan listened carefully, memorizing every name, every tone, every casual disregard for the people who had built the company. Nearby, the patriarch's son laughed loudly, recounting how he had almost lost his vacation home during the crisis and how unbearable that stress had been. "I cannot imagine living without a safety net," he joked. Ethan could imagine it very well. He had lived it. A woman approached Ethan holding a clipboard and without looking up asked him to move because he was blocking a camera angle. Ethan stepped aside without protest, allowing her to reposition decorations meant to impress guests who were already intoxicated by pride. Moments later, the same woman returned, scolding him for standing too close to the stage and suggesting he remain near the exits where staff belonged. Ethan nodded politely and complied. Across the room, a toast was raised to outsiders who had believed in the family company despite recent troubles. They thanked unnamed backers and promised to honor their trust with integrity and excellence. Ethan almost smiled. The music softened briefly and the daughter returned to the microphone, announcing that while the investor wished to remain private, there would be a ceremonial signing reenactment for photos and press. A blank folder was brought out and pens arranged as cameras flashed, capturing a moment meant to symbolize salvation. The patriarch signed dramatically, smiling broadly, shaking hands while applause erupted once again. Ethan stood silently, watching a performance meant to glorify an illusion. The real signature rested quietly in a secure archive already binding the future of everyone present. As the reenactment ended, a young man bumped into Ethan, spilling champagne onto his shoes and laughing awkwardly without apologizing before walking away. Another humiliation unnoticed by the crowd. Ethan felt no anger, only clarity. He saw now exactly who these people were when they believed no consequences existed. He remembered his early days meeting people just like them, smiling warmly while plotting advantage, believing wealth granted immunity. His phone vibrated softly in his pocket. A single message appeared. "Ready when you are." Ethan typed back. 5 minutes. He lifted his gaze, scanning the room once more, letting the laughter wash over him, knowing it would soon turn to silence. The band finished a song and applause followed as the lights dimmed slightly, creating an atmosphere of expectation. The daughter returned to the stage again, smiling confidently, announcing one final surprise to close the evening. She spoke of gratitude, of destiny, of how close they had come to ruin and how fortunate they were to have allies who believed in their name. She paused dramatically, letting anticipation build. Ethan stepped forward, slowly emerging from the shadows as murmurs rippled through the crowd, with people turning to see who was moving toward the stage uninvited. Whispers followed. "Who is that? Is he staff? Did someone let security in?" Ethan walked steadily, ignoring the confusion, until he stood near the steps of the stage. The daughter faltered briefly, unsure whether to stop or continue. Before she could react, the company lawyer stepped forward, his face pale, his posture rigid, as he recognized Ethan instantly. The room grew quieter. The lawyer cleared his throat and spoke into the microphone, his voice shaking as he addressed the crowd. "There is someone here tonight who deserves recognition." Confusion spread. The patriarch frowned. Ethan climbed the steps, calmly turning to face the room, at last meeting the eyes of those who had dismissed him all evening. His voice was steady when he spoke, carrying effortlessly across the ballroom. Good evening. Silence fell. I have enjoyed observing your celebration. Your relief, your pride. Faces stiffened. Some looked embarrassed. Others annoyed. Ethan continued. Earlier today I signed the agreement that secured the future of this company. The same agreement you are celebrating tonight. Gasps echoed. The daughter stared frozen. The patriarch's smile vanished. Ethan let the moment breathe before continuing. My name is Ethan Cole. And I am the investor you thanked without knowing. The owner whose presence you dismissed. The billionaire whose silence you mistook for insignificance. The room erupted into stunned murmurs. Ethan raised a hand gently and the lawyer amplified his voice again. I asked to attend anonymously because I wanted to understand who I was truly partnering with. Not in meetings. Not in rehearsed presentations. But in unguarded moments. He gestured around the room. What I saw tonight was revealing. Faces paled. Executives exchanged nervous glances. Family members avoided eye contact. Ethan continued. I saw arrogance where humility should live. Mockery where gratitude should stand. And entitlement where responsibility belongs. The patriarch tried to speak but Ethan's gaze stopped him. This deal stands. Ethan said. Because contracts are binding. But leadership will change. Oversight will increase. And accountability will begin immediately. Shock rippled through the crowd. Effective tomorrow, Ethan continued. There will be a full review of executive conduct. Labor practices. And governance. Some of you will not remain here. The words landed heavily. Ethan's voice softened slightly. Wealth does not excuse character. And survival does not erase behavior. He stepped back from the microphone nodding to the lawyer. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Ethan descended the stage as silence followed him like a shadow. No applause came. Only realization. As he walked toward the exit, people parted instinctively, their expressions transformed from arrogance to fear to regret. The woman who had mocked him earlier stared at the floor. The executives who had joked about layoffs stood motionless. The family who had laughed loudest now whispered in panic. Ethan exited through the same side door he had entered earlier. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos left behind. He paused briefly, breathing deeply, feeling no triumph. Only resolution. Because power did not need to shout. It only needed to arrive. The ballroom did not recover after Ethan Cole walked out, because silence has weight, and that weight pressed down on every conversation, every relationship, and every lie that had floated comfortably minutes earlier. People stood frozen where they were, holding glasses they no longer wanted, surrounded by decorations that now felt ridiculous, like costumes worn after the play had ended. The patriarch lowered himself slowly into a chair as if his legs had aged 20 years in a single moment, while his daughter stared at the stage, replaying every dismissive word she had spoken that night. Executives pulled phones from their pockets, reading messages that had already begun arriving from assistants, lawyers, and board members who understood exactly what had just happened. The family members who had laughed the loudest now whispered excuses to one another, trying to rewrite memories before consequences arrived. No one celebrated anymore. The band stopped playing, unsure whether music would insult the moment or expose their own fear. The lawyer approached the patriarch quietly, explaining that Ethan Cole was not a ceremonial investor, not a symbolic backer, but the controlling shareholder whose signature had transferred authority in ways that could not be undone. The patriarch listened without interrupting, because interruption would not change reality. Across the room, the woman who had mocked Ethan earlier pressed herself against a column, feeling suddenly visible in a way she had never experienced before. She remembered his eyes, calm, steady, and patient, and for the first time she wondered how many people she had treated the same way simply because she believed status protected her. The daughter rushed backstage, calling out orders that no longer carried weight, asking assistants to stop recording, to shut down social feeds, to contain damage that was already spreading. Phones buzzed constantly as guests received messages from contacts who had watched the live feed or heard rumors spreading through financial circles at lightning speed. Ethan Cole. Majority owner. Silent arrival. Public correction. By the time the celebration officially ended, the story had already escaped the ballroom. Across the city, analysts debated the implications while reporters scrambled to understand how a man worth billions had walked unnoticed through a room full of people desperate for his approval. Back at Ethan's private office, lights glowed softly as his team waited calmly because none of this surprised them. They had watched Ethan build empires quietly while others shouted and postured, and they trusted his judgment without question. When Ethan arrived, he removed his jacket, placed it carefully on a chair, and poured himself a glass of water, sitting down without urgency. His chief advisor spoke first, asking whether he wanted to delay the reforms until morning. Ethan shook his head slowly. "Begin now," he said. Across multiple floors, systems activated, audits launched, and access permissions changed with the precision of a machine that had been waiting patiently. Emails were sent to executives outlining immediate reviews. Security badges were scheduled for deactivation. Emergency board meetings were called. No announcement. No drama. Just action. Meanwhile, at the family estate, panic spread as relatives gathered, trying to understand how everything had shifted so quickly. The patriarch's son argued loudly, claiming this was an overreaction, insisting they had done nothing wrong. The daughter sat silently, scrolling through messages, reading comments from strangers who now saw the family not as victims of circumstance but as symbols of arrogance exposed. One message stood out. "Power reveals character when no one thinks they are being watched." She closed the phone slowly, feeling the truth sink in. The next morning the company woke to a new structure. An interim governance committee announced transparency initiatives. Whistleblower protections expanded. Executive compensation frozen pending review. Employees across departments read the updates in disbelief, recognizing that for the first time accountability was not a slogan but a process. Some cried quietly at their desks. Others smiled cautiously, unsure whether hope was safe. Ethan arrived early, walking through the main entrance, this time not because he needed recognition but because presence mattered. People looked up as he passed, unsure whether to greet him or step aside. Ethan nodded politely, acknowledging them as equals, not subjects. In a conference room, executives waited nervously, hands folded, rehearsing explanations that suddenly felt inadequate. Ethan entered calmly, sitting at the head of the table, not raising his voice, not asserting dominance. He spoke evenly. "This review is not punishment," he said. "It is clarity." He explained expectations clearly: ethics, respect, responsibility. Some nodded sincerely. Others hid fear poorly. One executive attempted to justify previous comments, minimizing harm, explaining they were under stress. Ethan listened patiently, then responded. "Stress does not excuse disrespect," he said. "It reveals it." The words ended the conversation. Outside the room, employees watched through glass walls, witnessing a power dynamic they had never seen before, one that did not rely on shouting, intimidation, or fear. By midday, news outlets confirmed Ethan Cole's identity, publishing profiles that traced his journey from anonymity to influence, highlighting his preference for quiet ownership and principled leadership. Public reaction shifted quickly, admiration replacing skepticism as stories emerged of companies he had rebuilt, cultures he had transformed, and leaders he had removed without spectacle. Back at the family estate, the patriarch sat alone in his study, staring at a portrait of his father, the man who had built the company with humility, discipline, and restraint. He realized with sudden clarity how far they had drifted. That evening the daughter requested a meeting with Ethan, not to negotiate, not to plead, but to apologize. Ethan agreed, meeting her in a neutral office without cameras. She spoke honestly, acknowledging arrogance, ignorance, and entitlement without excuses. Ethan listened quietly, then responded. "Apologies matter when followed by change," he said. "You have time to choose who you become." She nodded, tears forming not from loss of wealth but from the realization that character had always been optional until now. As days passed, the company began to stabilize not through reassurance but through reform. Employees noticed managers listening more carefully, meetings shortening, decisions clarifying. The culture shifted subtly like a tide turning. Ethan remained visible but unobtrusive, walking floors, attending briefings, asking questions others avoided. He did not humiliate anyone publicly. He did not celebrate. He corrected systems, not people. And slowly the humiliation that had once been directed at him transformed into introspection across the organization. Because when power exposes truth, the lesson lingers far longer than shame. Ethan Cole did not rush reform because speed often hides mistakes, and he preferred precision that lasted. He spent mornings reviewing reports not to hunt for enemies but to understand systems that rewarded arrogance and punished honesty. Each document told a story of shortcuts normalized and voices ignored and incentives misaligned. He met with employees at every level, sitting in small rooms without titles on the door, asking simple questions about how work truly happened. People were hesitant at first because trust does not appear on command, but when they realized he listened without judgment, words began to flow. They spoke of managers who mocked them publicly, of ideas dismissed because of accents, backgrounds, or lack of pedigree, and of long hours that went unseen. Ethan took notes carefully, not for optics but for memory. At the same time, the family felt the ground shifting beneath them as privileges they assumed permanent became conditional. Expense accounts were reviewed. Board seats re-evaluated. Decision rights clarified. The patriarch attempted to intervene, requesting a private meeting framed as collaboration but motivated by fear. Ethan agreed, meeting him in the same modest conference room where the real signing had taken place. The patriarch spoke at length about legacy, responsibility, and family honor. Ethan listened respectfully, then responded with quiet firmness. Legacy without integrity becomes liability, he said. Honor requires humility, not entitlement. The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. Outside that room the company watched closely, noticing how power now spoke in measured tones rather than grand gestures. The daughter began working longer hours, not to perform repentance but to learn operations she had never fully understood. She asked questions she once assumed beneath her. She listened where she once commanded. Some executives resisted change, subtly delaying cooperation, hiding behind procedure and bureaucracy. Ethan noticed immediately. He did not confront them publicly. He adjusted structures quietly, removing bottlenecks and replacing authority with accountability. When one executive attempted to rally others against the new direction, Ethan invited them all to a single meeting. He laid out expectations clearly, explaining that resistance to ethics was resistance to employment. There were no threats. Only choices. By the end of the week, resignations followed quietly without press releases or scandal. Employees noticed how swiftly noise left the room when substance arrived. The press continued speculating, expecting drama, revenge, and spectacle. They received none. Ethan declined interviews, releasing a single statement emphasizing commitment to sustainable leadership and respect for people. Public opinion shifted again, this time deeper, more thoughtful. Analysts called it rare restraint. Employees called it relief. One evening Ethan walked the factory floor alone, listening to machines hum and watching workers move with renewed confidence. A supervisor approached nervously, thanking him for listening earlier in the week. Ethan nodded, replying that listening was the least expensive investment a company could make. At the family estate, silence replaced arguments as members confronted uncomfortable truths about their behavior and identity. Some withdrew, retreating into denial. Others adapted, recognizing that survival now required character. The daughter sat with her mother one night, admitting she had confused admiration with authority and status with worth. Her mother listened quietly, realizing how easily pride becomes inheritance. As weeks turned into a month, the company stabilized, not because money flowed but because trust returned. Productivity rose, complaints dropped, innovation resurfaced. Ethan's team compiled results, presenting data that spoke louder than speeches. Ethan reviewed it once, then closed the file. Good, he said. Because success did not need applause. In private moments Ethan reflected on the night of the celebration, remembering every dismissive glance and careless word. Not with bitterness. With clarity. He understood now why he had needed to be there anonymously. To see the truth unfiltered. To choose partners with eyes open. He met with the governance committee, setting long-term cultural benchmarks, embedding accountability into systems rather than personalities. No one would ever again assume power without responsibility. As the month ended, Ethan stood in the same ballroom, now empty and quiet, where celebration had once masked arrogance. The chandeliers still sparkled, but the room felt different. Honest. He turned off the lights and left, knowing the real work had only begun. Ethan Cole began each day the same way, walking through different apartments without entourage, without announcement, greeting people by name when he could and listening when he could not. Employees who once avoided eye contact now nodded with cautious respect, sensing that attention was no longer a threat but an invitation. Managers learned quickly that reports filled with polished language meant nothing if workers told a different story, and that Ethan would always ask both sides. In meeting rooms, conversations slowed because people chose words carefully, not out of fear but because precision mattered again. The culture that had once celebrated proximity to power now rewarded clarity and responsibility. Across town the family grappled with a quieter reckoning as privilege lost its invisibility and became something that required justification. The patriarch attended his first operational briefing in years, sitting silently as department heads explained processes he had never truly understood. He realized painfully how insulated he had been. The daughter spent late nights reviewing contracts and policies, discovering gaps that had allowed entitlement to grow unchecked. She began documenting reforms not to please Ethan but to understand herself. One afternoon she requested another meeting, this time bringing proposals, not apologies. She outlined changes to family involvement, governance boundaries, and transparency measures that limited nepotism. Ethan listened carefully. When she finished he nodded once. "This is a beginning," he said. The words were neither praise nor dismissal. They were permission. Meanwhile executives who remained learned that authority now came with scrutiny. Performance reviews included ethics metrics. Bonuses tied to team outcomes, not individual dominance. Promotion paths redesigned to reward mentorship. Some struggled adjusting to a system that no longer celebrated intimidation. Others thrived discovering leadership did not require cruelty. At the factory level workers noticed tangible changes, schedules respected, overtime paid, concerns addressed quickly. Trust rebuilt not through speeches but through consistency. Ethan monitored progress through data and presence. When a department reported improvement he acknowledged the team, not the manager. When a failure occurred he asked what the system allowed rather than who to blame. This approach unsettled those accustomed to hiding behind hierarchy. It empowered those long ignored. Outside the company the narrative evolved again as journalists began profiling employees rather than executives, highlighting stories of renewal and accountability. Ethan declined attention, redirecting focus to teams and reforms. Power became quieter. Influence deeper. One evening Ethan met his advisory team reviewing long-term strategy. They discussed expansion opportunities, acquisitions, and partnerships. Ethan emphasized values alignment above valuation, making clear that money without integrity was a liability. The team agreed because they had seen the cost of arrogance firsthand. At the family estate conversations softened as blame gave way to understanding. Some members chose to step back from involvement, accepting that influence must be earned. Others committed to learning, contributing meaningfully. The patriarch began mentoring younger leaders, sharing hard lessons learned late but sincerely. He acknowledged to Ethan privately that survival without humility had nearly destroyed everything his father built. Ethan listened, then responded. "Learning late still matters," he said. "What matters is what follows." As months passed the company regained stability and reputation. Clients returned. Partnerships renewed. Talent applied. Not because the company shouted redemption but because behavior demonstrated it. Ethan observed quietly, satisfied not with dominance but with alignment. One afternoon he received a handwritten note from a factory worker thanking him for listening and for proving that power could be human. Ethan folded the note carefully, placing it in his desk. It mattered more than any headline. The fifth chapter closed with the company standing stronger, not because it had been saved financially but because it had been forced to see itself clearly. And clarity changed everything. Ethan Cole began the morning as he always did, walking through the main entrance without escort, greeting the security guard by name and asking about his family before continuing toward the elevators. The company felt different now, not tense, not fragile, but alert in a healthy way, like a body that had learned to balance after injury. Teams moved with purpose, meetings ended on time, decisions carried clarity, and excuses no longer found shelter in hierarchy. Ethan sat in a modest office reviewing a long-term report outlining 3 years of cultural metrics: turnover, innovation, safety, engagement, and ethical compliance. The data told a story more convincing than any speech. Where arrogance once slowed progress, collaboration now accelerated it. Where fear once muted ideas, trust amplified them. Ethan closed the report and leaned back, remembering the night of the celebration when chandeliers glittered over careless laughter. He remembered how invisible he had been. How instructive that invisibility proved. Across the company the family presence settled into its new form: limited, deliberate, accountable. The daughter now led a foundation arm focused on workforce development, partnering with trade schools and community programs she once overlooked. She worked long hours without cameras, learning how impact felt when it was not observed. The patriarch visited facilities regularly, not to command but to listen, acknowledging mistakes openly and modeling humility he had once believed unnecessary. Employees noticed and responded, not with awe but with cautious respect. One afternoon a full company town hall was scheduled, not to announce growth but to reflect on the journey. Ethan stood on stage without a teleprompter, without notes. He spoke plainly. We were saved financially by a signature, he said. But we were saved culturally by truth. He paused, letting the room breathe. Truth arrived when we believed no one important was watching. He continued. And it taught us who we were. He thanked teams by name, not position. He acknowledged pain without dramatizing it. He outlined commitments without promising perfection. The room responded, not with cheers but with steady applause that felt earned. After the town hall Ethan stepped away, allowing leaders to speak to their teams, reinforcing that no single voice owned the future. Outside journalists waited, hoping for quotes, drama or confrontation. Ethan offered none. Inside the company the work continued uninterrupted because stability had replaced spectacle. Months later the company faced another challenge: market shifts, supply disruptions, external pressure. This time the response was collective, measured, transparent. Ethan watched from a distance, intervening only to remove obstacles, not to command solutions. The company adapted quickly, proving that resilience built on values outperformed panic built on ego. One evening Ethan returned to the ballroom where the celebration had once taken place, now empty and reserved for a community event. Local students filled the space, listening to mentors sharing stories of growth, responsibility, and leadership. Ethan stood quietly at the back, smiling faintly. The room no longer belonged to arrogance. It belonged to possibility. A young student approached, recognizing him from a profile article, asking how to become successful. Ethan answered simply. Learn to listen when you think you matter least. Because that is when truth speaks freely. The student nodded, not fully understanding yet but remembering. As years passed the company became known not for the scandal that never broke but for the standards that quietly endured. Other firms sought guidance, not contracts, asking how trust had been rebuilt so thoroughly. Ethan shared frameworks, not secrets, emphasizing systems over personalities. He believed no company should depend on a single figure, even himself. On a quiet evening Ethan stood at his window overlooking the city lights, reflecting on the path that brought him there. He did not feel triumph. He felt alignment. He had been humiliated without name or recognition and had responded without spectacle or revenge. He had chosen revelation over retaliation, and the result reshaped lives beyond his own. The family learned humility. The company learned accountability. Employees learned safety. And power learned restraint. Ethan turned off the light, leaving the office empty, knowing the work would continue without him needing to stand in the center. Because the greatest measure of leadership was not being seen. It was being unnecessary.